Yes, yep. South China Sea, it's a huge area in Asia, and China pretty much claims sovereignty over much of it, despite all these counterclaims by other nations, including the Philippines, as well as calls from the U.S. and its allies to respect the rules, especially when it comes to international waters. So anyway, joining me to talk more about this is Gregory Poling, Director of Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Well, thanks for joining us, Greg. So let's just start things off with the latest incident, the dangerous maneuver by a Chinese pilot above the South China Sea. And when you saw that video, when the cockpit of the U.S. plane kind of like, was rocking, what was your first reaction? And what were you thinking like, what are the implications now?
The first reaction is that no pilot has ever been taught to fly that way. This is not safe behavior. It's intentionally meant to create risk to the U.S. and to other powers who claim to fly in international airspace in the South China Sea. And we've seen this increasing dangerously over the last year and a half. U.S. defense officials, Australian officials, Canadian officials have all complained in the last year about the rapid increase in the frequency of these Chinese air intercepts, which are intentionally unsafe. Last time we saw a collision over the South China Sea was 2001, when we had a USCP-3 ram into a Chinese fighter jet that was trying to intentionally create risks like this. That resulted in the death of the Chinese pilot, the emergency landing of the Americans and their temporary detention, and a huge diplomatic crisis. And that was at a time when U.S.-China relations were much better than they are today.
Now, when it comes to China's maritime, aggression, and how, they're building up all these, artificial islands around the area. What are some of the biggest concern that we should be at this point?
The biggest concern should be the risk of accidental escalation. Beijing has incentivized hundreds of Chinese actors, the Coast Guard, the maritime militia, these Air Force operators, to go out and intentionally break the rules in order to create risks, to escalate the tensions with Southeast Asian parties mainly, in the hopes that they'll eventually back down. And that means that every single day there's some risk of an accidental collision. And should that collision occur, particularly with a Filipino vessel, then the U.S. gets involved because of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So while we should certainly be worried about intentional escalation between the U.S. and China, more likely is accidental escalation between the U.S. and its neighbors in the South China Sea.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting that you point this out because, China and U.S., they're both trying to rule the region, Southeast Asia, right? And, wouldn't you think that, China should be sort of giving a little bit more leeway or opportunities or bend towards Southeast Asia somewhat a little bit more?
You'd think that, and it's a bit of a puzzle, because on the one hand, you have senior Chinese leadership, including Xi Jinping, on these goodwill tours, clearly trying to kind of re-enter the world, the diplomatic world, after China's COVID lockdowns. And that has a temporary effect every time a senior Chinese official comes through the region, but then the day in and day out behavior undermines all of that, as does the behavior of Chinese diplomats across the region, which are often tin-eared and heavy-handed. By comparison, the Biden administration has had some success. When you look at the relative public opinion polls, it's clear that in relative terms, China has become less popular, the U.S. has become more popular. Admittedly, that's after the pretty low level of the Trump administration. But still, the U.S. is stepping into vacuums that China is leaving behind.
And I just want to talk about Vietnam now. Vietnam is sort of expanding. There are some expansion plans in the Spratly Islands. And what is the significance of that? And what's the use of that?
Right. So Vietnam has, for decades, had the most number of these Spratly outposts, but they've all been relatively tiny. And Vietnam slowly built some of them up over the last 10 years, but then we saw this explosion of construction activity in the last half of 2022. Vietnam built something like 450 acres of new land, which roughly quintupled the size of Vietnam's holdings. Now, that still pales in comparison to what China built in just those 2 years, between 2014 and 2016, but it shows that Hanoi is serious about trying to make its islands more defendable, more resilient, improve the quality of life for its personnel. It also shows that Vietnam continues to see potential violence from China as its overriding national security priority.
And within ASEAN itself, do you see, the forming sort of like coalition, the countries that are more pro-U.S. and the countries that are more pro-China?
Yes and no. I mean, on specific issues, South China Sea being one of them, also some issues surrounding technology, economics, you do have divisions where the more like-minded, the Philippines, in some cases Singapore and Vietnam, in some cases Indonesia, are moving farther on certain issues than the rest of ASEAN is comfortable doing. I don't think that fits neatly into a U.S.-China box, though, because other than maybe Cambodia, the opinion doesn't suggest that there's really anybody in ASEAN who's overtly pro-China. There's countries who are overtly neutral.
What about Philippines, though? I mean, they have sort of made significant leaps under Marcos Jr.
Right. The Philippines is overtly pro-U.S. So there are one and maybe a couple who are overtly favoring the Americans. Most of the rest of the ASEAN states want to maintain positive relations with both. And to be fair, the Philippines does too. There's just certain issues touching on national security at which they cannot sacrifice their interests.
But Greg, how long can ASEAN just sort of, sit on the fence, right, and say, oh, we want to have the best of both worlds?
It can't. I mean, this is the reason that we have this explosion of mini-lateral institutions like the Quad and AUKUS and trilaterals and quadrilaterals involving certain members, because ASEAN has proven unable or unwilling to tackle the tough issues. And the tough issues are the ones that matter most to the member states.
And speaking of the Quad, as you've just mentioned, is there also the sense that, there isn't any Southeast Asian nation being invited to join the Quad, and that has, sort of also created that somewhat tension or that distance?
It creates a degree of wariness among South Asia, although some South Asian states are clearly big supporters. I'd note that the elite survey that the Institute for South Asia Studies here in Singapore does every year last year found that Vietnam prefers the Quad to ASEAN. So for some members of ASEAN, the idea that these four bigger external parties are going to deliver public goods is positive. It also puts impetus on ASEAN to say, if you don't like it, do something better. Like, come up with your own models for how these things should work. And ASEAN so far has been unable to do that.
I'm sure some of those discussions will be held here at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Thanks so much, Greg, for your time and thoughts on the South China Sea. And I was just speaking with Gregory Poling from CSIS.